Welcome. This is episode 6 of the Genomics podcast, and today we're talking about running biotech startups differently. We are your hosts, Maria Nadestad and
Robert Bucaleo. Our guest today is Kaja Wasik, who co-founded 2 biotech companies, and something tells us there will be more.
She also has a very interesting lifestyle that includes a lot of travel to a lot of interesting places. When we emailed her last week, we got an automated response saying, "I'm in a remote region of Kenya without Wi-Fi until July 7th. When we did get back to her, she casually mentioned that she was back from climbing Mount Kilimanjaro.
Here's a quick bio of our globe-trotting guest. After her PhD in genetics from Cold Spring Harbor Lab, she did a postdoc at the New York Genome Center. There, she spun off her research into her first biotech, Gencove. Gencove offers high throughput and cost-effective low-coverage sequencing. She then went on to co-found Variant Bio, whose goal is to make new drugs by studying the genetics of people with exceptional health traits. She recently stepped down from her position as CSO of Variant Bio, so we wanted to catch up with her, reflect on her experience, and hear about what's next. Welcome, Kaja.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's really nice to see you after many, many years since we all left Cold Spring Harbor. Welcome everybody.
We mostly wanted to talk about Variant Bio first of all, because it is very cool. So here's our understanding of the core concept or process. So you find a population with interesting health traits whose genetics are understudied in some way, partner with them to acquire genetic data ethically, while somehow making it beneficial to the community. And you use that genetic data to do research that can ultimately lead to developing new therapies. So can you flesh that out more and tell us about the word ethically and how much goes into that?
Yeah, so as you nicely summarized, the company covers a pretty vast landscape of kind of what we do, because what each one of these components is actually pretty complicated. So one, identification of these groups, it's not so obvious, right? So those are populations that on one hand will have a unique and properly and not previously not studied genetic architecture, right? So an architecture that allows rare genetic variants to rise to high frequency within that population, but also pretty unique health traits. So that can be, traits that are kind of epidemiological. For instance, there's more or less of a specific disease, or the disease that is maybe prevalent in this population has a slightly different progression. So we would consider that interesting. Or it could be an adaptation that we think could lead to some protection from disease. And I'm happy to later jump into some examples of that. So it's identifying them. That's pretty complex, because it's not that there's just like a published list of like, hey, if you work with the Maori, they have XYZ health traits. Then there is, once we identify this group, we have to build the relationship to see if they would like to participate in a research project. And we come into them as like we're a US company. So that sounds pretty threatening for a group that could be indigenous, that could be vulnerable in many cases. And then ultimately, we do all the kind of complicated logistical work behind collecting the data, which means we have to recruit participants, we have to consent them appropriately, we have to get all the local approvals to do this project, we have to get the community that we're working with their approval for the research that we're doing, and then ultimately have to have a team of nurses and healthcare professionals that will be able to get samples, blood samples from these participants, will be able to do complex measurements in these participants, ship them to processing facilities, and then analyze all of this data, and then prioritize potential therapeutic targets. We're predominantly interested in novel therapeutic targets, and then validate them in the lab and push them towards clinical trials. So that's a fairly long process. But you specifically asked about ethics, so let me talk about this a little bit more. So historically, we know that different communities, and especially because we're located in the US, I think we're a little bit more aware about the different indigenous communities that have participated in research, and specifically genomic research, they have not been always treated fairly by the researchers. They've been often taken advantage of, maybe because the research wasn't properly explained, and if you don't consent people properly, or you consent them in a very open manner, you can really take an advantage of what you do with their samples, what you do with their data going forward, and that ended up creating a lot of results that were published that were considered very stigmatizing to these specific communities. And ultimately, a lot of these groups just pulled out from participating in research. And now there's just a lot of distrust between academics, between different community groups, and between also companies that want to do this research. So knowing that, I was incredibly interested in the scientific question. That's how I started thinking about variant bio, knowing that there are groups with this unique architecture, there are groups with these unique health traits, and by being able to recruit these individuals, we can really boost our power to make significant discoveries. Because what we're looking for in order to create therapeutics, what you want to find is a single genetic variant with strong effect. Because if you want to make a drug, you want to target, a product of a single gene, and you want the effect of your drug to be robust. So those single genetic variants with strong effects is kind of what we went after. And by working with populations that went through some type of a bottleneck, or have a little bit more homogeneous, genetic background, you can reduce your numbers, right? So you can, instead of recruiting hundreds of thousands of individuals, you can recruit just a couple thousand individuals and have the statistical power to make these associations that otherwise would be very very hard to make. And then there's a couple examples of that. So for instance, one of the highest ever GWAS discovery regarding BMI was done in Samoa, where a genetic variant was identified in a group of, I think, 3,000 participants that very strongly contribute to this increased BMI among Samoan individuals. And again, the study was done by recruiting almost 3,000 individuals, but the same genetic variants exist amongst Europeans, so you could technically kind of replicate this result, but it is so rare in Europe that you'd have to recruit about 20 million people to have the same statistical power to make that connection. And I think the variant was at about 25% frequency in Samoa. So kind of based on that example, this is what we've been trying to replicate, but going for much more complex kind of medically relevant traits than just like simple anthropometrics. So this is why I was like, sorry, this is a very long digression, but this is why I was excited about the science behind it. But when I was starting this company, it was me and one of my actually best friends and a fantastic colleague from New York Genome Center, who I also knew from Cold Spring Harbor because we were in the same entering class. His name is Stefan Castell, one of the most talented computational geneticists I have ever met. When we started the company, we got initial funding of only $1.5 million from a visionary investor. I have to say that if they weren't interested in this idea, we would have never been where we are. So incredibly grateful. That's Josh Wolf from Lux Capital, who essentially initially served as like one of our founders because he was so excited about this idea. But the first person we hired after all of us talked about the complexity of this was a cultural anthropologist to be able to really understand how do we even embark on that conversation with different groups and how to work with them. The first board that we've established in the company was our ethics advisory board that is very diverse, comes from a variety of diverse backgrounds to be able to help us engage with these groups. The first advisor that we got his name is Keola Fox. He's a native Hawaiian geneticist who helped us build out the network and kind of have those early stage discussions to understand what are the biggest fears that these groups have when it comes to partnering on genetic research. And what we've learned is actually, it's not impossible. A lot of people thought it's going to be impossible to work with these groups, but honestly, they want, and I don't shouldn't be talking on their behalf, but at least my understanding is that they want transparency. They want to be able to build trust and know that you're not trying to trick them into doing something that they don't know about. So just like being very transparent about what this project is, what are the goals of this project, and also they'd like to incorporate their own goals. In majority of cases where we did our project, when we started it, after doing a consultation about the project, we've learned that the community in question might have their own research questions and they'd like to incorporate them, or there might be things that they don't want us to look at, and we might exclude these specifically from the project because they are worried about stigmatization or things like land rights, or maybe they have a certain belief regarding their history of how they settled specific region, and they wouldn't want genetic findings to maybe contradict those beliefs. So having that honest discussion really helps with creating boundaries around what is it that you're going to do with this data, and like what is it that you can one day put out there and publish regarding that data. So, and then the last thing was obviously some reciprocity, right? If people believe that if they participate in a research project, they should benefit from that research project. And I think that's kind of obvious, and a lot of us don't really think these ways because, like, for instance, I've participated in a ton of research projects and I never thought that like, oh, I should get something in return. But the truth is that I am getting something in return. Like every bit of data that we all contribute to creates maybe better therapeutics or better diagnostic tools. But, the issue is that these therapeutic and diagnostic tools are kind of catered towards the majority of people that participate in this in this research, as predominantly individuals who are of European ancestry, right? So if I know that if I participate, there will be therapeutics targeting me a little bit better. But if I'm from a group that doesn't have direct access to these therapeutics right now because they live in Madagascar or they live in Kenya, they don't really see a direct benefit of participating in research, because these benefits, if they reach them, it will be so far. It's so far away from when they contribute that they just are not going to make a connection. So those were the kind of just to summarize that in 2 sentences. The most important thing were consultation and benefit sharing, and that's what we focused on. And then the last thing that we really wanted to ensure in all of our projects is going back with results, because that was another very common complaint, is that researchers come in and like maybe they talk to us and explain the project, they collect a bunch of samples and they disappear and they publish a paper that in many cases is like behind a paywall, or the community that participated doesn't even know that it exists, or they can't interpret it. They just want somebody to come in and actually explain, like, hey, what does this all mean? Everything that you've done, did you find something? Can you explain it to us properly? So that's another commitment that we've made, to go back to these groups and deliver these results. And we have done that. The results, I think, it takes a while to get to the results. The recruitment is pretty long, and then the analysis. But we have this year done a number of these trips, and they're published on our blog, where you can kind of hear about where we've been going, what we've been telling to people.
We have so many questions. So we found a few of the populations you visited, like the Faroe Islands and French Polynesia. Mm-hmm. There were nice videos online. Our listeners can Google for that. But how many of these projects have you done?
I think at this point we're close to like 25 projects.
Wow.
So it's quite a lot of them, and they're of different sizes. So some are smaller pilot projects, which are a little bit easier. Some are kind of joining research that already has been locally ongoing, so they're also slightly easier to set up. But some are just spun out from scratch, and that those require a little bit kind of more attention, especially initially. But I think we've done research on every continent, excluding the southernmost.
Antarctica.
So how important was it to you to travel to each location yourself, meet the people whose data you were collecting, and try to convey to them like what the benefit is to them?
Yeah, so actually that's a great question because when we started the company and we received like we properly could really like start these projects after our second round of funding that happened within a year of founding the company, and we were very excited. We recruited our incredible CEO that left the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to start. He's been traveling the world. Everybody was looking forward, saying, "Okay, now we have 25 million, let's go." And that's when COVID hit. Basically, like essentially, our CEO was flying from Seattle to meet the team in New York. The company was started in New York, and as he landed in New York, there were all those warning signs. There's COVID in New York. The airports might get closed. He turned around, got on a plane, flew back to Seattle, and we didn't meet him for the next 6 months. So we haven't met our CEO in person for like a total, I think, of 8 months since the day he kind of signed his documents. But so yeah, COVID started, and then travel just died, which in a sense was, I think, ultimately a blessing, because as we were kind of getting ready to launch, we did start interacting with some of these groups, but they all really wanted to meet you in person, which is obviously very time consuming to go to all of these locations, because I also need interpreters. I need like people who understand cultural practices in this region. It's not very very simple, and at the same time I feel very conscious about like burning CO2 just to go and meet people back and forth, because building relationships online wasn't established, and it was not established anywhere. Also within the US, every board meeting, anything that was happening in business, like everybody had to see everybody in person. And the pandemic did change that dramatically for all the workers, but also for these communities that just immediately jumped online and were very flexible. And we actually built a lot of these relationships, and a lot of these projects started just by talking the same way we're chatting right now. So on Zoom, and like doing a lot of back and forth, because sometimes you just learn that maybe it was great to meet the potential partners, but there's reasons why the project can't happen, right? And you would probably have to spend a lot of time kind of traveling to figure it out. But there's times when you can just kind of get to that point on a couple calls. We've signed some of our initial agreements on Zoom, which was also, the University of Antananarivo, that was their first virtual agreement. They did insist on us to have a stamp, so we created like a virtual stamp that we put on the PDF. So no, it was a lot of fun. But then when the travel kind of restrictions eased a little bit, we did make sure that at least one person from the company goes and visits every single group that we are working with, and that was usually kind of that we made it around like delivering some like progress report around the project, or some results, or some like ethical training, some local capacity building, kind of depending on the needs. But there's always an event organized around that. So now we've definitely met everybody. I can't say that I've traveled to every single project location, but it's also, when you start building that relationship, I can't build 25 relationships, right? So some of these are much deeper. So I go repeatedly, or spend more time with certain partners for projects that really rely on the relationship that I have built. And for different team members, it's the same. So they will kind of go more to one location rather than just jumping everywhere.
I want to ask a little bit more about the benefit sharing. So we also heard mentioned something about providing funding to local health and education programs or something. Can you go a little bit more into detail on what that looks like?
Yeah, so that was really, I think that's the most kind of, maybe besides the science, innovative thing about the company, is that we believe that research participants deserve a piece of the pie. Like if we become successful as a company, we want them to also kind of share a part of that success. So the benefits that we set up are There's two types. There's short-term and long-term benefits. So in the short term, what it is every project has a budget, and then a percentage of this budget goes back to the community. I think it's usually around 10% of the budget, and they get to really vote how to spend that money. And the ideas are incredible, and they cover a really vast landscape of things, from infrastructure investments to like legal representation for certain cases, a lot of healthcare. There's a number of different cultural kind of initiatives. It's really depending on the community needs, and we don't really in any way suggest what that should be, with some exceptions, like we wouldn't support maybe a political party. So there's just like some limitations in terms of where the funds can go. So that's what happens in the short term, and that is actually incredibly appreciated, because a lot of people come in and promise that, like, hey, one day when we're very successful, we'll give you something back, but that rarely happens. So people really appreciate to get to have something tangible, as the recruitment ends. And in the long term, what we have done is 4% of our future revenue, and just revenue is very different than profits. So it's not like the typical 1% of profits. You cannot gain revenue. It's like all the money that comes into the company before you pay salaries, before you reinvest it in R&D. So 4% of the revenue will go back to all of these communities that have participated in these projects, and it's not tied to any findings. It's not tied to like a size of a specific group. It's kind of distributed evenly back to support the same initiatives, or they can choose different initiatives, kind of in the areas of healthcare, education, culture, capacity building, etc. And that is on a yearly basis in perpetuity, as long as we exist as a company. There's no revenue yet. We still need to get there, but also 4% of the company equity has been put aside to so that it's committed to kind of the same cause, and that 4% is undilutable. So no matter how many additional rounds of funding we will go, and how many additional shares options we need to issue, like we always add more to that specific pool. So in case we, for instance, IPO as a company, then we can maybe use these funds to either disperse them immediately, or depending if it's a lot, it could be potentially like a huge amount. We could use it to see the foundation that's going to again disperse them yearly. So that's the benefit sharing. And recently we have also signed a pledge to ensure that any therapeutics that we develop or that our partners develop, will make sure that they will be available at affordable prices in the places where the data has been generated from. So to ensure that the communities that we work with will have access to kind of the medical results of these projects. And that's something that our CEO pushed based on his kind of background from the Gates Foundation, and that's something he has a lot of experience in doing. So we're very excited about this addition to our benefit sharing. And just in terms of like the medical results, I just want to clarify, we do give our participants access to all the clinical data that we collect on the spot, but we do not give any genetic interpretation, because the sequencing technology that we're using is low pass whole genome sequencing. So we sequence the genome to about 6x. So a lot of it is being imputed. So we kind of just to take a step back on this, we recruit a couple of thousand individuals, 2,000 to 3,000. We build a local reference panel by sequencing a subset of these individuals to high 30x coverage, and then we sequence everybody else to lower coverage, and then use imputation. So an imputation is essentially, for those who are not familiar with, is guessing. So we can't, based on that, give people genetic information. Because we could be wrong about certain findings. Plus, one thing that I find very, interesting, but also sad, is a job that we think is pretty common, genetic counselor, that we, see left and right in the US, is really not very prevalent around the world. So actually giving people the information and having somebody interpret that information. Like, we can't, because I'm not a medical professional in Madagascar, so it has to go through some intermediary who's going to be able to interpret this information. That's really not trivial. So we decided that under no circumstance we're delivering individual genetic results, but we do come back to talk about population level findings within these groups.
That's very cool. And so you mentioned you do the low coverage sequencing. Are you using the same technology that you helped develop at Gencove to do that?
Yeah, so that is very exciting. So this is how the two companies kind of connect. So when we're doing this at Gencove, we've realized that low pass sequencing just works much better for imputation than genotyping arrays, because you don't run into this ascertainment bias, and that kind of originated this idea like, hey, this is a really good technology to use to build like genetic databases in populations that have not been properly represented in genetic studies. So it's evolved significantly. I think when we started Gencove, the main thing we focused on is like, let's make sure it's competitive in terms of price. So we started with what I'd call like homeopathic levels of sequencing. So that was like 0.2x, human genome coverage, because we're like, how much is an Illumina GSA array? Oh, it's $50. Like, how deeply can we sequence the human genome on some like HiSeq for $50? Was 0.2x. I think that was the first attempt, and it was still better. So now you can do much more than that. So I think we right now are somewhere between 4 and 6x in our projects, and Gencove has also increased kind of with the dropping sequencing prices. You can basically keep your price pretty much constant, but you actually increase coverage.
That's fantastic. I really I don't know of other biotech companies that do this much for the communities they work with, like the 4% of revenue, the affordable therapies. Where did you get these ideas from? Because clearly I don't think there are other players in the field that are doing the same thing.
I mean, there's not that many. I honestly, I knew we had to do something, and then we were iterating for a while on what could that be. Like, should we be giving individuals, equity in the company? Because like, I think we made that connection immediately from day one, that people need to get something. Like, we can't expect somebody who is in a potentially dire financial situation to just donate all of this data, spend a day like undergoing this battery of tests. I mean, they're all non-invasive, or I guess it's considered minimally invasive, because we do a blood draw and then just like pat them on the back and have them leave. We never felt comfortable with paying you individually for because that's just like, thanks, paying somebody for their genome, mostly because if you come from a small community, when you share your genetic information, you share the information about your kids and your parents and your community as a whole. So why would you get the like $100 or whatever you never would be? But also like putting a price tag on like, this is what this information is worth. That made us incredibly uncomfortable. So the long-term benefit sharing was, we knew that it has to be some percentage of like the company success. The short-term benefit sharing came later on, just because we immediately kind of got this feedback of like, a lot of people come in and promise, and there's distrust. So we had to go back to our investors saying, because in this case we're spending the VC money, right, giving it back to these communities, but we have a fantastic board that was very supportive of that. And in terms of the 4%, basically we were thinking for a while, like, what should it be, right? Like, what is the right number? And I don't know if this is the right number. It's a number, and we can test it out. And like, maybe there'll be people who will say it's too much. There's some people who will say it's not enough, right? But like, hopefully that will encourage other companies to test it out themselves. And for us, it came from basically we think about the data that we collect as like, well, we have data from the entire population. There is a chance we're going to find something that's therapeutically relevant. Like, what is that chance? I don't know. 1 in 10 of these projects will give us a potential therapeutic target. We just didn't know because and there's not enough information, I think, out there to even do this math. But we thought like, okay, it's fairly risky, right? It's not like every group that we go to, all of a sudden this genome becomes a gold mine, and then there's like 100 therapeutic targets. We knew it's not. We definitely knew it's not that. So we knew it's still a fairly risky kind of undertaking. And then we contacted basically tech transfer offices at US universities to see, what royalties would they expect for like a very early stage risky technology. And it ended up being an average of 3.5%. That's what we went to our board with. And our board said, like, why won't you make it 4? So that was it. Yeah.
Nice. So you talked about how, you don't want to pay individual people, but then how do you engage with a community? Like, does the community end up having like one representative? Are they like a government person? How does the community as a whole decide on come together to make decisions about what short-term benefit sharing they want? Who's like going to get sequenced? How do they interface with this together?
It's incredibly difficult, and there's no simple question, because it really depends, how different groups are organized. And some, for instance, like a lot of the indigenous groups in the US, they have a very clear process. It's like, this is what you like to do, this is what you submit, there's a group that is going to discuss this, there's a group that is going to consult it within their own communities, and you really have to do kind of very little besides just like providing all the documentation and like maybe presenting in front of that group. If it was like that everywhere, it would have been incredibly easy, but it's not, because a lot of groups are not organized in this way. So for instance, our project in French Polynesia, there's no it's a country that is technically France. There's a lot of indigenous people living on all of the archipelagos, but they don't have any indigenous representation that you can go to and say like, could you liaise with the people and ask them if this is an appropriate thing. So for instance, just to dive into this specific example, what we did is we searched for community consultants, and it's not like that job exists. So we had to find somebody who would have like the right skill set to do this. And we found 2 incredible women, Vehia Wheeler and Tehani Mairai, and their backgrounds were, one had a background in environmental research. So she did some community kind of consultation projects around like infrastructure. So she kind of understood the like going in front of a group and trying to gather feedback around a specific project. And Tehani had a very interesting background because she had a background in tourism, and actually her job evaporated during COVID. So she was on the market, but she knew everybody on every island, because a lot of tourism is kind of connected to what are the cultural activities that are offered, in this specific part of the islands. And she knew all the kind of cultural and mostly local leadership that represents like culture, that represents politics. So she had connections to the government. So together they were an incredible team that spent 4 months traveling through the Polynesian archipelago with a set of questions, and like recording, people's answers. And they talked to the politicians, they talked to people from cultural associations, they would go to like a youth club or to like an elderly association, just to make sure there's an equal representation of men and women, that there are people kind of from very different life walks and background. And yes, they've compiled this like incredible consortium of what are people's fears, where would they like to see the benefits going to. And then ultimately me and Sarah, our director of ethics and engagement, went there again for 2 weeks and liaised with a number of different community members. We also kind of recorded this process, because that was our first very complex project like that. So we also kind of recorded a lot of our conversations. And yeah, that's what it was. It's not simple. It can be incredibly complex at times, especially if you're just like appearing out of nowhere. But there's also kind of a third way, is where you are working locally with somebody who already is very well connected to the community. And we had projects like that too in South Africa with Michelle Ramsey, and in Australia and Norfolk Island with Lynn Griffiths, where they have been working with the Norfolk community and a number of different communities in South Africa for a period of, like 10, 20 years. And they had like deep relationships, and they've actually already done very proper community engagements for the projects that they were doing in the past. So they just had to replicate it for us. And that also works. That's great for us if we can do that, but we also have to do kind of due diligence on the academic partners that we partner with to make sure that, they have done this in the past, or they're willing to do this, going forward. But yeah, again, there's no simple answer. The goal is to ask as many people as you can and have them point you to very specific initiatives. I think in Tahiti we ended up sending funds to 7 different initiatives spread across all the archipelagos, just to make sure that it's fair and that kind of the benefit sharing will cover all the archipelagos where we have been recruiting participants from.
Yeah, that makes more sense than emailing hello@frenchpolynesia.com. So it's
Yeah,
good to know the details there. But yeah, so speaking of the French Polynesia project, maybe let's dive into this a little more. And that's one project that kind of immediately made sense to me because they have a very high incidence of gout compared to the other populations. So
yeah.
it makes sense to study their genetics. How did you decide to investigate gout? Like, did you start with a disease or do you start with a population?
Yeah, so I think initially we, when we started Variant, we decided to just go where the science takes us. We weren't prioritizing any specific diseases. We were just pretty open. But right now, initially based on those initial findings, we decided to focus on a couple different areas. So that's in kidney disease, because we have very promising projects and findings in that area. In inflammatory disorders, predominantly liver, and then different types of immune inflammatory related disorders like gout and fibrotic diseases. So that's the area where we are pretty much sticking to, with some exceptions. We have one project in India in ALS that also kind of is historical before we made that commitment to specific areas. So, gout for me was, I didn't know, I knew very little about it. I feel like most of us, it seems like a fairly like obscure disease when you live in the US. There's not that many people that have it, although it's actually more than, I think it's around 5% of the population, which I've learned, which I had no idea in the US. It's something between 3 and 5% of the population. In France, if you want to compare French Polynesia, we just like metropolitan France, that's going to be like 1% of people. And all of a sudden, we hear from these Polynesian doctors that, well, nobody's counted. So they tell us there's a lot of gout. We see a lot of gout. We are sure there's a lot of gout. We don't know how much, because nobody has done a appropriate epidemiological assessment of gout. And sometimes you just have to be trusting and say, well, let's jump into this and like truly believe them that there's a lot of gout in French Polynesia. And when we designed our project, we actually, just to make sure, this is again kind of the like, what does the population need? And actually, they do need an epidemiological assessment and understanding of how many gout cases there are. And we were very lucky to find a French doctor who did his residency in French Polynesia, and he's the one. He's a rheumatologist. He's the one who's been alarming about there's so much gout in French Polynesia. We have to do something. So we partnered with him and Lille Catholic University, where he's a medical professional at, and we did design this project in order to be like a very appropriate epidemiological, statistically representative sample where we can actually count how much gout there is. And we've learned that there's about 25% of adult population of French Polynesia has gout, which is, it's crazy. I can't even find other words for that. It's just shocking how much gout there is, and it's shocking that nobody realized. And what happened is the French Polynesian Ministry of Health now has all of this data, and they're reprioritizing kind of what are the most important diseases, where the funding is going. So in a benefit sharing sense, that is also like a very important benefit that could be shared with those groups, is making sure that there's now financial resources to tackle that. Plus the one thing that was problematic and still is that gout is very stigmatizing, because people are afraid to go to the doctor because they feel they will be told, you have gout because you drink too much, because you eat bad food, and people don't want to, people are afraid to hear that, because it has right now, it's an incredibly stigmatizing disease. But even from these numbers, I can tell you, it's not like 25% of people in French Polynesia eat like the French kings. There's definitely a very clear genetic component based on the numbers. And I think like it's going to be also very empowering for people once we can say like, hey, we know what this is, and this is it, to say it's not, it's not your fault. Like obviously you have to take care of yourself. You have to make sure that you eat healthy, but it's the reason you have this disease. It's not because you don't, take care of yourself.
Right. Yeah, I had only heard of the dietary factors before. I think it showed up on royal pains at one point. Somebody had won the lottery and like got gout because they were eating lobster every day and something like that. And yeah, it never occurred to me that there would be such a genetic background to the disease. Like, it sounds like people must have a huge predisposition in order to have such a high incidence in the population. Like, there's no way they eat that much worse than Americans. There's no way.
Yeah, no, they don't. And it's, seafood is something that contributes to gout. And you could think, and you can see it a lot across French Polynesia. I mean, across just like the Pacific, there's populations just have a lot of gout. But, there's other islander nations out there, and they don't have 25% of gout within the population. So it's not going to be only seafood. It's like seafood, tomatoes, and beer, I think, are some of the most common, and red meat contributors to gout. But like honestly, then everybody in the States should have gout, right? So, and some of the genetic factors are known because some of this research has been done amongst the Maori. There's a very high kind of proportion of gout there too, and we've expanded our research. So we are actually studying gout also in other populations in the Pacific. There's just a lot of gout and kidney disease there in general. So this is our focus in the Pacific. But and some of these genetic factors, as I said, are known, but like the ones that are known do not really explain the prevalence. So hopefully we'll have some good results to report. This, unfortunately, we haven't managed to analyze all of that data yet. We're just barely done generating it, so there's still some time before we can put it out there, or we find nothing. That's also a possibility, that it's just like a very complex genetic contribution, and we can't pick it up.
Yeah,
that's fascinating. When we were looking at the statistics from one of the videos on the Variant Bio website, we kind of assumed this was like a known thing, but it's really nice to see that you had to like actually figure it out working with local doctors who had a hunch. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's not. Most of our projects actually start because there is there's somebody locally who has a hunch that like, hey, I think there's something different going on here. And sometimes it isn't, and but in most cases it really is. And this is, I think, how our best projects really started, is by talking to a lot of like researchers, healthcare professionals, and just listening to these groups yourself, because people understand their health problems, and they will talk about them openly.
Can you share a couple other examples of diseases in a particular population or health traits that were just really standing out to you when you saw it?
Yeah, I think one of my, so this is, because we've talked about a little bit about diseases, but I think like one of my favorite examples is kind of around protection, because that is ultimately what you want to find, because like you would love to mimic a protection with your drug, right? If you find something that contributes to disease, it's not necessarily like obvious that you'll be able to use it. You might figure out this is the gene, this is the pathway, but nothing there might be nothing there that is therapeutically viable. But protection is very exciting. So there's this one project that we're working on with Professor Julian Ivroll, who's a professor at Princeton University. He started it many years ago. He started this project together with another researcher, Amanda Leah from Vanderbilt University. It's called the Turkana Genome Project, and it also has an incredible Kenyan PI, Dr. Dino Martins, who is right now the CEO of Turkana Basin Research Institute. So when you think about all the most like incredible archaeological findings coming from Kenya, he's really in charge of that, and that's in the region that this project is happening. So basically, Turkana, the project started, I think, because the researchers really wanted to find a group that is undergoing a lifestyle transition. So Turkana are traditionally nomadic pastoralists. They live in northern Kenya and on the border with Uganda and Sudan. This is a fairly hostile region. It's incredibly hot. There's very little water sources there, so people actually our data from this project indicates that like over 90% of people are considered, chronically dehydrated based on the standards that we know of that are not specifically from the Turkana population, but they based on like urine gravity, they're chronically dehydrated. So there's very little water. The water has high levels of salinity, so that's 7 times over what is considered healthy to drink by WHO. So you have this like very low water and those like not easy to kind of drink water sources, and people's diets are very, very specific. So like the real traditional kind of nomadic pastoralists, they would predominantly drink camel blood with goat milk. So that's now obviously there's an ongoing transition. There's kind of just like shops showing up. So the diet is slowly changing, but there's still a lot of people living this traditional lifestyle. So, to a lot of researchers, that this offered a possibility to see what kind of, non-communicable diseases start popping up in this population as they move, from those nomadic groups to maybe rural groups to then like urban groups within Kenya. And you kind of see what you expect. You see hypertension going up, you see diabetes going up. So this is how this project started. But as they started collecting health data, we've all realized that like one thing that should be very prevalent there should be kidney disease, like based on this diet that is super high in protein, the constant dehydration, the fact that water has a lot of salinity, like that's just like abuse for your kidneys, right? So like why isn't everybody's like glomerular filtration rates, aren't they just horrendous? But you'd see people like even older age living this life their whole lives with very healthy kidneys. So that's what attracted our attention, and this is what we wanted to really kind of interrogate, is like what's going on. Is there some protection? And that's where also some cool population genetics jumps in place, because I think we're one of the very few companies that actually uses population genetics methods to identify potential relevant biology. So what was done in the Turkana genomes is just a selection scan. So basically looking at which parts of the genome tend to be under selection, and that has been actually published by what we've learned about this wasn't published yet, so this is why we started collaborating with Julian's group at Princeton. They found a selection in a gene that's involved in a genetic variant in a gene that's involved in glomerular filtration. So, to me, like this environment and this as like a piece of evidence, that's just like, wow, this is incredibly interesting. So now we're doing a much bigger project where we're recruiting 3,000 Turkana, and we're also doing like a very detailed kind of evaluation of kidneys, of different kidney related parameters, just to try to understand what might be going on there when it comes to kidney biology.
Oh, that's a really cool example. Yeah, I love the idea of going after places where people seem to have some kind of protection from disease. Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, no, that's my favorite. I shouldn't say that, but it's one of my one of my favorite projects. Yeah.
So you have anthropologists on staff. What does an anthropologist do in a project like the French Polynesian one? Because I've never heard of that in a biotech.
Yeah, so we have, I think, but you probably would be familiar with like what biological anthropologists would be doing because like, some biological anthropologists are just become geneticists and it's like, it's just like, they basically do science projects. But the cultural anthropologists, they're incredibly interesting because they are just incredible at basically just understanding all the potential sensitivities around the project, and they're really good at kind of diving into what should be said, what shouldn't be said, what type of language to use, how can we, they have networks where like the way you have networks of geneticists. If somebody told you like, hey, do you know anybody at Princeton, or do you know anybody in that country, be like, oh yeah, here's all my people. Is the same way they're like, well, here's our network of cultural anthropologists in India. If you want to work with this specific group, we'll help you identify, because the community consultants are one thing, right? So those are like people from the community who actually are not scientists and can talk about the project in very lay terms, but then this entire like ecosystem of like making sure that we're doing everything correctly will also always involve like local anthropologists to kind of understand like, are there any specific sensitivities that we should be aware of ahead of time when we work with this population, to even like finding interpreters to be able to like communicate in the correct language and so on. So yeah, that's what they do. So they're on this kind of they're somewhere between like ethics and how to do things right, and then just like logistics of personal connections, how to build personal connections, and how to make sure that you're asking the right questions and getting the right answers, and how to interpret them. So yeah, they're incredibly useful. They basically help you place you in a cultural context that you're completely unfamiliar with. That's what it is in one sentence.
Yeah, I think there's so many innovative parts about the way that you collect the genetic data. And then there's some science after that, but then at some point you start to develop drugs. How do you think about doing that in-house versus trying to license some of the genetic data or results that you have from the research and like partnering with another company that focuses on just developing therapies?
Yeah, I mean, when we started Variant, I was hopeful that we won't have to go all the way there. I think I was pretty naive then and thought like, oh, we'll get those amazing targets and just like we can then just like sell or license those targets. But the problem is there's very little appetite for novel targets that haven't been properly validated and that don't have some like encouraging human data. And I just didn't know that initially, and that's what I've learned fairly quickly. And our fundraising was only possible if we were to say, yes, we have to like push this forward. And that's where majority of that target is worth very little. A validated target is worth very little. It's probably worth less than the cost of this project, right? So, but something that is entering clinical trials is worth much more, and then it's just the value kind of increases. So that's what we decided to do, to push these projects as far as we can to kind of maximize what we can get for them as a company. And as a small company, it's definitely not possible for us to do multiple clinical trials. I don't even know if we're going to do one all the way till the end. But we kind of have to push our internal research as far as we can, just to ensure that if we even sell or license an internal asset that's going to provide all a lot of value to us going forward, because like ultimately, you know, we have to pay for all these projects that we've done, and like not just pay for them, we have to like realize return for our investors, you know, and ensure that we are profitable as a company, because that's also how our partnering communities make money at the end of the day.
I also thought that drug targets were valuable in and of themselves. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah,
so
that's
you
disappointing.
Yeah, it is, right? I've seen a lot of companies that
Yeah.
do fancy data science or AI or something to create drug targets, and it seemed like those would be valuable on their own. So are
Yeah.
all those other companies doing all the fancy AI stuff also going to realize this and not make any money unless they can take it all the
Yeah,
way?
I mean, I honestly, I don't know. It's very possible, right? Because like a target is like what at the end of the day, it's like some association, right? That like, hey, we have this thing that, you know, points to it contributes to kidney disease, and then we have all this additional data that colloquializes with it, so we maybe can even explain some mechanism. But that's still very, very far away from like making a small molecule that, you know, is going to actually pass like safety and efficacy. I could imagine, you know, companies that can find a purpose for like shelved maybe compounds that passed like human safety, but the efficacy was off, because like maybe they should be applicable in kind of other disease context, you know. Repurposing those, yes, that is definitely something valuable, and obviously we're looking at that too, right? But in yeah, but other than that, like my understanding of this, and again, I'm not like I'm not a pharma executive, I'm not a VC, I'm not like some market expert, but you know, in our experience, I've learned that targets are not very, very valuable unless you can like produce thousands of them. I don't know. I don't know if anybody needs thousands of them, but maybe then like you can, if you can like sell thousands of them together, it becomes valuable.
And what's the thing that's furthest in the drug development pipeline at Variant Bio so far?
Yeah, so this is our kidney disease project, and we are at a point where, you know, with it, and that project is in discovery phase. So that is basically a small molecule kind of optimization phase. So clinical trials are not going to start for at least another year, probably more, but it's far enough for it to be incredibly exciting. And there's a couple projects that are fairly close to that. So hopefully at some point you'll see some patents once they become public for for you know, all of these. But yeah, we're kind of very excited, and honestly like a little surprised how fast we've managed to get where we are as a company. And this is why I also decided like it's time to switch leadership, because you know, my background is in designing these projects and trying to ensure that we can, and of course it's not just me, it's, you know, Stefan, it's like an incredible team of computational statistical geneticists, anthropologists, and MDs. So like when I say I was just a little part of that. So the incredible group that has been responsible for just like designing these projects and starting to building these relationships, and you know, ensuring that we have the right quality data. But right now, what we're switching towards is we have to put majority of our funding towards pushing this pipeline forward and making sure that we get as close to like a clinical trial as possible, because we'll need that for the next fundraise. So for the company to raise funding again successfully, we have to show something, you know, approaching the clinic or in the clinic. So we'll also be scaling down a little bit of new projects, not like aggressively, but just a little bit, just to make sure that we have the financial reserves to really push these laboratory like projects forward as far as we can.
That makes a lot of sense. We were going to ask exactly that question of whether you stepping down as CEO signals a phase change away from focusing on,
Yeah.
starting new projects with new populations, and sounds like yes, which is unfortunate because I think that that's where all the innovation is, or well, I'm sure there's other innovation, but we're
Yeah.
particularly excited about that aspect of variant bio.
Well, it doesn't mean, there's a lot of projects ongoing, and it doesn't mean that there's not going to be new projects. There still will be some new projects, maybe, not as many as we had currently. And it doesn't mean that like in a couple years we can't really revive, that project muscle and start doing them all over again. Is just, at this point as a company you have to be kind of financially frugal, and we want to make sure that we don't have to raise funding again before we have this super exciting data, because then we can raise hopefully a lot of funding in the way that with conditions that are very favorable to us. So we're not going to be like a risky investment. So I think that's the right way to go forward. We found a lot of stuff. There's still a lot of projects like in the process of generating data, like a lot of data sets that haven't been, like we're just completing kind of sequencing or doing metabolomics or proteomics, or these are super complex projects, and actually the amount of data is huge. So we also have to make sure that we slow down to give the team that is analyzing it enough time so that we don't create this like backlog of data. So I think it's like a natural cycle of like slow down and then accelerate again, hopefully.
Maybe let's dive into the entrepreneurship side of things. So in a 2021 interview with ASHG, the American Society for Human Genetics, you said that you spun out your first company, Gencove, because large institutions have a huge inertia when it comes to any decisions. Is there a fun story behind that?
No, I don't really want to, harp on any specific institutions. But yes, it is hard. It is hard when you want to do something fast, when you want to do something innovative, when you want to do something a little bit risky. It's not the job of large institutions to be like, fast and like iterate quickly and be, well, they should be innovative. So I'm not going to say that, but to basically move aggressively forward and take a lot of risk, right? So I think that's what's if you want to do that, you should jump ship and work for a startup. There's also other things besides just the speed. It's the freedom to, once you raise your funding, like obviously you have to kind of report back to your board, but you're relatively free to do kind of whatever spend the funding however you want, as long as you're kind of moving in the direction that you told your board. So you can you can just like stop and regroup and change direction, and that's amazing. So I love this this possibility to be this dynamic. Plus, it's much more collaborative. That has always been my experience. I think I probably mentioned in that interview too. Is I love working with teams where people don't compete for like I'm the first author, or this is my project. Stay away from my project. Which I've experienced in academia quite a lot, and it just doesn't happen in industry. So I love what I've done in my last 8 years in industry, but there's also certain things that I missed. Like, for instance, there's a lot of things that we found that were exciting and pointed to potential exciting biology, but it was not like health or disease focus, or like would potentially not lead to identifying novel therapeutics, and you just can't go there. So you can't just be driven by curiosity. You always have to think like everything that you do is, the ultimate goal is to develop therapeutics and do it as fast as you can to make sure that your investors are happy, and they should be. They took a risk. They gave you money, right? So you owe it to them to make sure you don't just dilly-dally and get excited about exciting biology. So that's sad, and I do think I appreciate both, and this is why I'm kind of diving back into academia. So I'm taking, after stepping down, I'm taking a 1 year at least sabbatical. Well, sabbatical sounds very fancy, but I just want to learn new things. I feel like this will sound very braggy, but I feel like I've started the coolest company in human genetics. So yeah, I don't think I can start anything like as exciting again. So I'm just like actually diving back in partially doing some academic research. So I'm an adjunct professor at the Craig Venter Institute, and I'm a visiting scholar at Princeton, kind of trying to dive into some of the things that I've learned also working at Variant that I can expand on, like things that we just weren't very excited about.
Can you talk a little bit about your journey and just like show people that you weren't like born this awesome?
No. I mean, it's, believe me, I failed so many times and made so many mistakes. It's just like the things that I'm now open to talk about is they sound awesome, but it was not definitely it wasn't easy. My journey to Variant Bio was actually to even Gencove and the New York Genome Center was pretty complex. So when I finished my PhD at Cold Harvard, and I decided to do a postdoctoral training with George Church. I said that he accepted me to his lab. I wanted to work on the Mammoth project. I was like, well, how can I do something that's like absolutely crazy? The Mammoth project sounds amazing. I'll do this. Changed my mind after 3 months. I said, I'm not going to do this. Moved to California. Got a job offer from Theranos, decided not to do that, so I never joined.
Wow.
Then then got a job offer from another startup that I wish I took because it did really well. I would have been like employee number 4. Well, I don't know. I guess I wouldn't be where I am right now. So then decided to move back to New York and worked for my first. Like the first time I worked with a startup was in New York. The startup is called Epibone. I think it still exists in New York. It was focusing on growing human bones for transplants for like people who suffered like some bone fractures and that were kind of irreplaceable. I think they were focusing initially on like replacing jaws. Spent maybe 5 months working there, and like my big lesson from there was like I want my own company. Like I love this is fun, I want to do this, but I want this to be mine. One of the main reasons was because a lot of the research was happening in pigs, unfortunately, and I was a vegan, and I like really in this I told everybody when I joined, like, hey, I'm just like not going to do the pig bit, but it was like impossible to be a team member and not, receive like a huge head that came to the lab and be like, somebody's to cut the jaw out and it's right there and you're the only people in the lab. And I was like, oh God, okay. So this is why I decided. I met actually Stefan, who I think I've mentioned here already, co-founder at Variant. He was doing his postdoctoral training at the New York Genome Center, and he introduced me to Joe Pickrell, who was a professor at the New York Genome Center in Columbia, and who wanted to start a company, and together we're brainstorming about this like low pass whole genome sequencing idea. I spent a year doing a postdoc in his lab, and we've been just continuously fundraising for Gencove, and it was really hard, but we've managed to just at some point secure around $800,000, and me, Joe, and Tomas, who was another postdoc in Joe's lab, just abandoned ship. But Gencove changed dramatically. Like we started just laughably as a competition for 23andMe. But it was supposed to be like a better ancestry prediction service. So it has evolved significantly. Kind of now it's mostly, there was like a kind of like a hardware element to it. Now it's mostly software, and it's really cool. But it became like something completely different. So yeah, it wasn't straightforward. It wasn't like I was born with this idea, and the idea behind Variant was was generated while I was at Gencove, and I just saw like, oh, this technology is actually really useful to for working with underrepresented genomes and identifying novel genetic variants.
Where can people find you online if they want to follow what you're up to?
I'm on Twitter. I'm one of the researchers that haven't left yet. So at Kaja Wasik, I'm still there. And I am on LinkedIn, which I started using a little bit more recently.
And is there anything you want to share with people? Tell them what you've got going on that they can follow. You mentioned a fundraiser.
Yeah, I am fundraising for a fantastic organization called Life Science Cares that is focused on lifting our communities from poverty. They work in a number of major cities in the US, and they do it by engaging life science companies and like life science professionals to help fundraise, to help teach, to help kind of do one-on-one mentoring, which I'm also volunteering with them doing mentoring for kids that are interested in moving towards life science. I'm almost at my I almost met my goal of raising $25,000. And in order to for all of you who contribute and who don't contribute to enjoy what you've contributed to, I'm going to hike through presidential mountains with a team of life science entrepreneurs and VCs for a period of 3 days to kind of show that, like, hey, this is what we're doing for your contributions. So please feel free to contribute if you can. Actually, if you go on my Twitter or LinkedIn, I think I kind of every now and then bring up the fundraise. But if you also just Google Kaja Wasik fundraiser, that's probably the first thing that will pop up. And I welcome any support. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.